3 years ago. Amelia awoke to find dozens of ticks attached to her body, crawling over her bedroom windowsills and through the floorboards just to get a small taste of her precious blood. That's how we knew my sister had been selected. She was ecstatic. Everyone was actually our classmates, our teachers, the mailman, our town's deacon, the kind Colombian woman who owned the grocery store. They were all elated by the news. Amelia's a great kid, a real fine specimen. Makes total sense to me, my grandpa remarked, his tone swollen with pride. Even our parents were excited, in spite of the fact that their only daughter would have to live alone in the woods for an entire year, doing God only knows to survive. The night of the summer solstice, Amelia would leave, and the previous year's selected would return, passing each other for a brief moment on the bridge that led from Camp Ehrlich to an isolated plateau of land known as Glass Harbour. You see, being selected was a great honour. It wasn't some overblown richest kid wins popularity contest either. There were no judges to bribe, no events to practice for, no lucky winners or shoo-ins for the esteemed position. Selection was pure because nature decided you were chosen only on the grounds that you deserved the honour and unbiased evaluation of your soul, through and through. The town usually had a good idea who that person was by early June. Once nature decided, there was no avoiding their messengers. Amelia could have bathed in a river of insect repellent, and it wouldn't have made a damn bit of difference. The little bloodsuckers would have still been descending upon her in the hundreds, thirsty for the anointed crimson flowing through her veins. Every summer around the campfire, the counsellors would close out their explanation of the selection process with a cryptic mantra. 17 words that have been practically branded on the inside of my skull, given how much I heard them growing up. Those who leave for Glass Harbour have perfect potential. Those who return a year later are perfect. Amelia was so happy. I vividly remember her grinning at me, warm green eyes burning with excitement. Although I smiled back at her, I found myself unable to share in the emotion. I desperately wanted to be excited for my sister. Maybe then I'd finally feel normal. I contemplated. Unfortunately, that excitement never arrived. No matter how much I learned about selection, no matter how many times the purpose of the ritual was explained, no matter how much it seemed to exhilarate and inspire everyone else, the tradition never sat right with me. Thinking about it always caused my guts to churn like I was seasick. I reached over the kitchen table, thumb and finger moulded into a pincer. While Amelia gushed about the news, there had been a black and brown adult deer tick crawling across her cheek. The creature's movements were unsteady and languid, probably on account of it being partially engorged with her blood already. It creeped closer and closer to her upper lip. I didn't want the parasite to attach itself there, so I was looking to intervene. Right as I was about to pinch the tiny devil, my mother slapped me away, hard. I yelped and pulled my hand back, hot tears welling under my eyes. When I peered up at her, she was standing aside the table with her face scrunched into a scowl, a plate of bacon in one hand and the other pointed at me in accusation. "Don't you dare, Thomas. We've taught you better." I understand feeling envious, but that's no excuse. I didn't bother explaining what I was actually feeling. Honestly, being skeptical of selection, even if that skepticism was born out of a protective instinct for my older sister, who would have sent my mother into hysterics, it was safer for me to let her believe I was envious. Instead, I just nodded. Her scowl unfurled into a tenuous smile at the sight of my contrition. "Look at me, honey. You're special too. Don't worry," she said. The announcement was sluggish and monotonous, like she was having a difficult time convincing herself of that fact, let alone me. I struggled to maintain eye contact, despite her request. My gaze kept drifting away. Nightmarish movement in the periphery stole my attention. As Mum was attempting to reassure me, I witnessed the tick squirm over the corner of Amelia's grin and disappear into her mouth. My sister didn't even seem to notice. Like I said, she was ecstatic. Every kid between the ages of 7 and 17 spent their summer at Camp Ehrlich, no exceptions. From what I remember, no one seemed to mind the inflexibility of that edict. Our town had a habit of churning out some pretty affluent people, and they'd often give back to the camp that gave them everything with sizable grants and donations. Because of that, the campgrounds were both luxurious and immaculately maintained. 8 tennis courts, 2 baseball fields, a climbing wall, an archery range, indoor bunks with AC, a roller hockey rink, etc., etc., etc. I won't bore you with a comprehensive list of every ostentatious amenity. The point is, we all loved it. How could we not? I suppose that was the insidious trick that propped up the whole damn system. 95% of the time, Camp Ehrlich was great. It was like an amusement park recreation centre hybrid that was free for us to attend because it was a town requirement. A child's paradise hidden in the wilderness of northern Maine, mandated for use by the local government. The other 5% of the time, however, they were indoctrinating us. It was a perfectly devious ratio. The vast majority of our days didn't involve discussing selection. They sprinkled it in gently. It was never heavy-handed, nor did it bleed into the unrelated activities. A weird assembly one week, a strange arts and crafts session the next. None of them taking us away from the day-to-day festivities long enough to draw our ire. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. The key was they got to us young. Before we could even understand what we were being subjected to, their teaching started to make a perverse sort of sense. Selection is just an important tradition, a unique part of our town's history that other people may not understand, but that doesn't make it wrong. Every prom designates a king and queen. Right, most jobs have an employee of the month. The selected are no different special people with a special purpose on a very special day. The selected don't leave forever. No, they always come back to us safe and sound. Better. Actually, think about all the grown-ups that were selected when they were kids, and all the important positions they hold now: senators, scientists, lawyers, physicians, CEOs. Isn't our town just great? Aren't we all so happy? Shouldn't we want to spread that happiness across the world? That would be the neighbourly thing to do, right? What a load of bullshit. Couldn't tell you exactly why I was born with an immunity to the propaganda. Certainly didn't inherit it from my parents. Didn't pick it up from any wavering friends, either. There was just something unsettling about the selection ceremony. I always felt this invisible frequency vibrating through the atmosphere on the night of the summer solstice, a cosmic scream emanating from the land across the bridge, transmitting a blasphemous message that I could not seem to hide from. The selected endured unimaginable pain during their year on Glass Harbour. It changed them, and it wasn't for their benefit. It wasn't really for ours, either. Okay, so tell me, who was the first selected? I demanded. The amphitheatre went silent and the camp counsellor directing the assembly glared at me. Kids shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Amelia rested a pale, pleading hand on top of mine. Her fingers dappled with an assortment of differently sized ticks, like she was flaunting a collection of oddly shaped rings. "Tom, please, don't make a fuss," she whimpered. For better or worse, I ignored her. It was a week until the summer solstice, and I had become progressively more uncomfortable with the idea of losing my sister to Glass Harbour for an entire goddamn year. "How do you mean?" the counsellor asked from the stage. Rage sizzled over my chest like a grease burn. He knew what I was getting at. "I mean, you're explaining it like there's always been a swap one. Selected leaves Camp Ehrlich, one selected returns from Glass Harbour. But that can't have been the case with the first person. It doesn't make sense. There wouldn't have been anyone already on Glass Harbour to swap with. So my question is, who was the first selected? Who left Camp Ehrlich to live on Glass Harbour without the promise of being swapped out a year down the road? It was a reasonable question, but those sessions weren't intended to be a dialogue. I could practically feel everyone praying that I would just shut up. The counsellor, a lanky, bohemian-looking man in his late 50s, forced a smile onto his face and began reciting a contentless hodgepodge of buzzwords and platitudes. "Well, Tom, selection is a tradition older than time. It's something we've always done, and something we'll always continue to do because it's making the world a better place. You see, those who leave for Glass Harbour have perfect potential, and those who—" I interrupted him. I couldn't stand to hear that classic tagline. Not again. Not while Amelia sat next to me, covered in parasites, nearly passing out from the constant exsanguination. You're not answering my question. But fine, if you don't like that one, here's a few others. How does selection make the world a better place? Why haven't we ever been told what the selected do on Glass Harbour? How do they change? Why don't the selected who return tell us anything about the experience? And for Christ's sake, how are we all comfortable letting this happen to our friends and family? I gestured towards Amelia, a pallid husk of the vibrant girl she used to be, slumped lifelessly in her chair. The counsellor snapped his fingers and looked to someone at the very back of the amphitheatre. Seconds later, I was violently yanked to my feet by a pair of men in their early 20s and dragged outside against my will. They didn't physically hurt me, but they did incarcerate me. I spent the next 7 days locked in one of the treatment rooms located in the camp's sick bay. Unfortunately, maybe intentionally, they placed me in a room on the 3rd floor, facing the south side of Camp Ehrlich. That meant I had an excellent view of the ritual grounds, an empty plot of land at the edge of camp. A cruel choice that only became crueler when the summer solstice finally rolled around. As the sun fell, I paced around the room in the throes of a panic attack. I slammed my fists against the door, imploring them to let me out. I'm sorry for the way I behaved, really. I wasn't thinking straight, I begged. Just, please, let me see Amelia one last time before she goes. No response. There was no one present in the sickbay to hear my grovelling. Everyone, the staff, the kids, the counsellors, were all gathered on the ritual grounds. No less than 1,000 people singing, lighting candles, laughing, hugging, and dancing. I watched one of the elders trace the outline of Amelia's vasculature on her legs and arms in fine, black ink. A ceremonial marking to empower the 16-year-old for the journey to come. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help myself. The crowd went eerily silent and averted their eyes from Amelia and the pathway that led out of Camp Ehrlich. As was tradition, for the first time in my life, I did not follow suit. My eyes remained pressed against the glass window, glued to my sister. She was clearly weak on her feet. She lumbered forward, stumbling multiple times as she pressed onward, inching closer and closer to the forest. As instructed, she followed the light of the candles into a palisade of thick, ominous pine trees. Supposedly, the flickering lights would guide her to the bridge, and then Amelia was gone, swallowed whole by the shadow-cast thicket. I never got to say goodbye. 30 minutes later, another figure appeared at the forest's edge. Damien, last year's selected, walked quietly into view. He then rang a tiny bell he'd been gifted before leaving 365 days prior. That's all the counsellors ever gave the selected. No food, no survival gear, no water, just an antique handbell with a rusted, greenish bell bearing. The crowd erupted at the sound of his return. Once the festivities died down, they finally let me out of my cage. Over the next year, I continued to feel the repercussions of my outburst. When I arrived home from camp in the fall, my parents were livid. They had been thoroughly briefed on my descent. Dad screamed. Mum refused to say anything to me at all. Grandpa just held a look of profound sadness in his eyes, though I'm not sure that was entirely because of his disappointment in me. I think he missed Amelia. God, I did too. None of my classmates RSVP'd for my 14th birthday party. Not sure if their parents forbade them from attending, or if they themselves didn't want to be associated with a social pariah. Either way, the rejection was agonizing. For a while, I was broken, didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't really think much. No, I simply carried my body from one place to another. Kept up appearances as best I could. Unilateral conformity seemed like the only route to avoiding more pain. One night, that all changed. I was cleaning out the space under my bed when I found it. The homemade booklet felt decidedly fragile in my hands. I sneezed from inhaling dust, and I nearly ended up snapping the thing in half. When Amelia and I were kids, back before I'd even been introduced to Camp Ehrlich, we used to make comics together. The one I cradled in my hands detailed a highly stylized account of how me and her had protected a helpless turtle from a shark attack at the beach. In the climatic panels, Amelia Roundhouse kicked the creature's head while I grabbed the turtle and carried it to safety. Beautifully dumb and tragically nostalgic, that booklet reawakened me. She really was my best friend. At first, it was just sorrow. I hadn't felt any emotions in a long while, so even the cold embrace of melancholy was a relief. That sorrow didn't last, however. In the blink of an eye, it fell to the background, outshined by this blinding supernova of white-hot anger. I shot a hand deeper under the bed, procured my old Little League bat, gripped the handle tightly, and beat my mattress to a pulp. Battered the poor thing with wild abandon until my breathing turned ragged. The primordial catharsis felt amazing. Not only that, but I derived a bit of a wisdom from the tantrum. What I did wasn't too loud, and I expressed my discontent behind closed doors. A tactical release of rage, in direct comparison to my outburst at a Camp Ehrlich the summer before. Expressing my skepticism like that was short-sighted. It felt like the right thing to do, but God was it loud. Not only that, but the display outed me as a non-believer. And what did I have to show for it? Nothing. Amelia still left for Glass Harbour, and none of my questions received answers. Because of course they didn't. The people who kept this machine running wouldn't be inclined to give out that information just because I asked with some anger stewing in my voice. If I wanted answers, I'd need to find them myself. And I'd need to do it quietly. 4 months later, I was back at Camp Ehrlich. Thankfully, the counsellors hadn't decided to confine me as a prophylactic measure on the night of the solstice. I did a good job convincing them of my newfound obedience, so they allowed me to participate in the festivities. That year's selected was only 10 years old, a shy boy named Henry. I watched with a covert disgust as the counsellors helped him take his iron pills every morning, trying to counterbalance the anemic effects of his infestation. Everyone bowed their heads and closed their eyes. As I listened to the sad sounds of Henry softly plodding into the forest, I reviewed what I'd learned about Glass Harbour through my research. Unfortunately, I hadn't found much. Maybe there wasn't much out there to find, or maybe I wasn't scouring the right corners of the internet. What I discovered was interesting, sure, but it didn't untangle the mystery by any stretch of the imagination either. Still, it had been better than finding nothing, and Amelia was due to return that night. I wanted to arm myself with as much knowledge as humanly possible before I saw her again. Glass Harbour was about 2 square miles of rough, uninhabited terrain, a plateau situated above a freshwater river running through a canyon hundreds of feet below. The only easy way onto the landmass was a wooden bridge built back in the 1950s. At one point, there had been plans to construct a water refinery on Glass Harbour. Multiple news outlets released front-page articles espousing how beneficial the project was going to be for the community, both from a financial and from a public health perspective. Clean water and fresh money for a better community. One of the titles read, "All that hubbub, all that media coverage, and then nothing. Not a peep, no reports on how construction was progressing. No articles on the refinery's completion. For some reason, the project just vanished. It has to be related. I thought, the ticks draining blood, the idea of a water refinery, there's a connection there. A replacement of fluid, detoxification or something. Truthfully, I was grasping at straws. Amelia will fill in the rest for me. I'm sure of it. I was so devastating naive back then. None of the selected ever talk about what transpires on Glass Harbour. It's considered very disrespectful to ask them about it. But it's Amelia, I rationalised. She'll tell me. Of course she'll tell me. The sombre chiming of a tiny handbell rang through the air. My head shot up, and there she was, standing tall on the edge of the forest. Amelia looked healthy. Vital. Her skin was pest-free and no longer pale. She wasn't emaciated. Her body was lean and muscular. She was wearing the clothes that she left in, blue jeans and a black Mars Volta t-shirt, but they weren't dirty. No, they appeared pristine. There wasn't a single speck of dirt on her outfit. We all leapt to our feet, cheering. For a second, I felt normal, elated to have my sister back. But before I could truly revel in the celebration, a similar frequency assaulted my ears, that horrible cosmic scream. From the back of the crowd, I stared at my sister, wide-eyed. There was something wrong with her. I just knew it. My attempts to badger Amelia into discussing her time on Glass Harbour proved fruitless over the following few weeks. I started off subtle, I hinted to her that I knew about the watery refinery in passing, nudged her to corroborate the existence of that enigmatic building. "You must have come across it," I whispered one night, waiting for her to respond from the top bunk of our private cabin. I know she heard me, but she pretended to be asleep. Adolescent passion is such a fickle thing. I was so headstrong initially, so confident that Amelia and I would crack the mysteries of selection wide open. But when she continued to stonewall me, my once voracious confidence was completely snuffed out. Emotionally exhausted and profoundly forlorn, I let it go. At the end of the day, Amelia did come back, mostly. If I didn't think about it, I was often able to convince myself that she never left in the first place. On the surface, she acted like the sister I'd lost. Her smile was familiar, her mannerisms nearly identical, but she was different, even if it was subtle. An encounter I had with her early one August morning all but confirmed that fact. I woke up to the sounds of muffled retching coming from the bathroom, followed by whispering, and then again, retching. I creeped out of bed. Neon red digits on our cabin's alarm clock read 4:58 a.m. I tiptoed over to this bathroom door, careful to avoid the floorboards that I knew creaked under pressure. More retching, more whispering. I could tell it was Amelia's voice, for some inexplicable reason, though the bathroom lights weren't flicked on. As gently as I could, I pushed the door open. My eyes scoured the darkness, searching for my sister. Given the retching, I expected to see her huddled up in front of the toilet, but she wasn't there. Eventually, I landed on her silhouette. She was inside the shower with the sliding glass door closed, sitting on the floor with her back turned away from me. Honestly, I have a hard time recalling the exact order of what happened next. All I remember vividly is the intense terror that coursed through my body, heart thumping against my ribcage, cold sweat dripping down my feet and onto the tile floor, hands tremoring with a manic rhythm. "Amelia, are you all right?" I whimpered. The whispering and retching abruptly stopped. I grabbed the handle and slid the glass door to the side. A musty odour exploded out from the confined space. It was earthy but also rotten smelling, like algae on the surface of a lake. My eyes immediately landed on the shower drain. There were a handful of small, coral-shaped tubes sprouting from the divots. Amelia was bent over the protrusions. She had her hands cupped beside them. An unidentifiable liquid dripped from the tubes into her hands. Once she had accumulated a few tablespoons of the substance, she brought her hands to her mouth and ferociously drank the offering. I gasped. Amelia slowly rotated her head towards me, coughing and gagging as she did. Her eyes were lifeless. Her expression was vacant and disconnected. In a raspy, waterlogged voice, she said, "It's such a heavy burden to carry the new blood, Tom." The previously inert tubes rapidly extended from the drain and shot towards me. I screamed. Or I thought about screaming. It all happened so quickly. Next I remember, I woke up in bed. Amelia vehemently denied any of that happening. She insisted it was a bad dream. Eventually, I actively chose to believe her. It was just easier that way. From that summer on, Amelia's life got progressively better, and mine got progressively worse. She graduated valedictorian of her class, received a full ride to an Ivy League college with plans to study biochemistry. She's on track to becoming the next Surgeon General, my dad would say. Amelia had plenty of close friends to celebrate her continued achievements as well. Me, on the other hand, barely made it through high school. No close friends to speak of, though I do have a steady girlfriend. We initially bonded over a shared hatred of selection. Over the last year, Hannah's been my rock. We fantasied about exposing selection to the world at large, writing up and publishing our own personal accounts of the horrific practice, hoping to get the FBI involved or something. Recent events have forced our hand earlier than we would have liked. 3 weeks ago, Amelia died in a car crash. Her death sent shockwaves through our town's social infrastructure, but not just for the obvious reasons. Everyone's grieving, myself included, but it was something my dad whispered to my grandpa at her funeral that really got me concerned. None of the selected have ever died before. Not to my knowledge, at least. By definition, this shouldn't have happened. Does it break the deal? Does anyone know what to do about this? The more I reflected on it, the more I realised that my dad was right. I didn't personally know all of the recently selected. There's a lot of them and they've scattered themselves throughout the world, but I'd never heard of any of them dying before. Not a single one. "Don't worry," my grandpa replied. "We can fix this. It won't be ideal, but it will work." This morning, I woke up before my alarm rang due to a peculiar sensation, a powerful need to itch the inside curve of my ear. My sleepy fingers traced the appendage until they stumbled upon a firm, pulsing boil that hadn't been there the night before. A fully engorged deer tick was hooked into the flesh of my ear. I found 30 other ticks attached to my body in the bathroom this morning, on my palms, in my hair, over my back. This is only the beginning. The solstice is only 6 days away. Please, please help me. I don't want to change. I don't want to go to Glass Harbour. I don't want to carry the new blood. First, it was Ava. Shames me to admit, but I don't recall much about her. I was 7 years old when I spent my first summer at Camp Ehrlich, and I'd only seen her wandering about town with her adolescent compatriots a few times prior to that. I remember she had these soulful white-blue eyes like a newborn husky. 2 sprightly balls of crystallized antifreeze sequestered behind a pair of rimless, box-shaped glasses. That was before she departed for Glass Harbour, however. By the night of the solstice, Ava had become lifeless, borderline comatose. Selection and its vampiric ambassadors drank the colour from the poor girl's face until her cold, pale skin nicely matched her seemingly bloodless eyes. Her disrepair was ultimately irrelevant. It's not that we didn't care, it's more that it just didn't matter. We all still bowed our heads and closed our eyes, as was tradition, of course. We didn't watch as Ava dragged her desiccated body into the candlelit mass of pine trees. We didn't observe or pity her frailty because it was transient. In 1 year's time, she'd emerge from those pines a perfected person, healthy, whole, and human. Right. Then it was Lucas. He was strong but reserved. Soft-spoken but sweet. Helped me up when I fell off my bike once. The pines swallowed him, too, but he did come back. Right. The next year, Charlotte was selected. After that, Liam, followed by Evelyn, James, Amelia, Henry, Bailey, and Jackson. And then, finally, it was my turn. To make up for Amelia's untimely death, nature had selected me. A divine runner-up for the esteemed position. To the town's credit, they were pretty close. I've learnt that 67 was the number required to fulfill their end of the bargain. Before Amelia died, there were 65 of them out there in the world. In the end, though, they failed. What's worse, they wouldn't even understand why they failed until I returned from Glass Harbour, 364 days ahead of schedule. But hey, it was a virtuous pursuit all the same, a noble cause. They did what they could to make this world a better place, because those who leave for Glass Harbour have perfect potential. Those who return a year later are perfect. Right. After Tom. My grandfather's raspy voice trickled into my ears, a gentle, tinnitus-laden crescendo that exiled from my mind's eye images of all the selected who had walked this path before me. My gaze fell from the sky to the old man kneeling near my ceremonial seat on the ritual grounds. The night of the solstice had arrived at Camp Ehrlich. Did you say something, Grandpa? I muttered. A faint chuckle left his lips, causing his bushy silver moustache to quiver. I said, "Hold still. Your legs are squirming up a storm, and this is precise work," he remarked, bringing his fine-tipped acrylic pen into view. I nodded, and he returned to tracing the vasculature of my right calf over my skin. "If you hold still, there might be time for dancing after I'm done here." "You know," he declared, his tone upbeat and playful. I ignored his attempt at levity. Something he said struck me as odd. I could have sworn these markings were just to empower me for the journey to come, so why would they need to be precise? He acted like he didn't hear me, but I felt the pen's pointed tongue falter slightly as I posed the question. It wasn't too hard for him to feign deafness, though. The ritual grounds were buzzing with jubilant noise and frenetic movement. Hundreds of kids gallivanting around the gigantic empty field on the southern edge of the camp, chatting and laughing and playing. A piano concerto droned over the camp's loudspeakers. I'd heard it plenty before, not that I could name who composed it. The tune was lively and melodically lush, but it wasn't necessarily happy-sounding, something I'd never noticed until that moment. Bittersweet is probably the right word. I wasn't the centre of attention like I imagined I'd be, either. No, I was more like a fixture of the party rather than a person being celebrated. The maypole that everyone danced around, symbolic but inanimate. Why do these markings need to be precise, Grandpa? I repeated. He pretended not to hear me better the second time around. I let a volcanic sigh billow from my lungs. The display of frustration finally prompted him to respond. You know, Tom, Amelia wasn't like this. She embraced selection with open arms. God rest her soul. You could stand to have a little more dignity. It's the least you can do to honour her memory. My eyes drifted back into the sky. I found myself comforted better by the purple-orange swirls of cloudy twilight than my own flesh and blood. Yeah, well, that was her default setting, wasn't it? More than anything, she wanted approval. You know how hard Mum was on her growing up? She was desperate for unconditional acceptance, and selection gave it to her. I don't know much about Mum's parents, but maybe if she was raised by someone more like you, she would have been a smidge more generous with her love. If I'm being honest, though, I've been desperate for approval too, even if I didn't chase after it like Amelia. Never had Mum dote over me like she has this past week. The around-the-clock home-cooked meals have been nice. The way she's looked at me has been nicer. He let the pen fall away from my skin, but did not look up. That said, her grace didn't make a huge difference in the end. Did it? I continued. Closed casket funeral before she even turned 21. Fell asleep at the wheel and drove headfirst into oncoming traffic. Amelia was a tiny blip on the world's radar. You know that, right? Nothing more, nothing less. She was born, selected, and then exhausted, so much so that it killed her. What a fucking miserable waste. It was hard to determine whether he agreed with me, or if my indignation had made him livid. He put the pen back to my skin, shaking his head vehemently, but he did not respond to my tirade. For the next few minutes, I leaned over and silently watched him perform his cryptic duties. With the climax of the concerto blaring over the speaker system, its melody crackling with static, I noticed something alarmingly peculiar. In my lethargic, blood-drained state, I don't think I would have picked up on it if I wasn't actively watching. I know it's important, even if I don't know why yet. To be clear, I wasn't alone in that rickety and white chair. No, I was utterly infested with ticks. I'd given up counting the total number. The surface of my body had lost its smooth, contoured surface, and it had been replaced by a new, biologic geography. Peaks and valleys that were constantly shifting as the parasites scoured my frame, seeking to excavate fresh plasma from my weathered skin, and, of course, it was improper to remove any of them. Mum sure as shit beat that lesson into my head over the last week. But then, how had Grandpa been so precisely outlining my vasculature? Weren't the ticks in the way? They were. That wasn't a problem, however. When Grandpa needed one to move, he'd simply tap their engorged black hides, and they'd move. Somehow it seemed like they understood his command. I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it myself, before I could even find the words to the question I wanted to ask. The concerto came to a close, and the ritual grounds hushed. Everyone sat down where they were, closed their eyes, and bowed their heads. My grandpa handed me the ceremonial bell and whispered something that pushed me forward. As soon as you step onto Glass Harbour, ring this, but not a moment before. Be strong. Don't let your sister's sacrifice be in vain. And with that, I stood up and trudged towards the nearest candle, flickering at the edge of the pines, casting shadows that writhed and cavorted over the landscape like the spirits of something old and forgotten, begging for recognition. I won't. The walk from Camp Ehrlich to the bridge wasn't long, but goddamn was it surreal. Silence was customary in the liminal space that existed between one selected leaving for Glass Harbour and the other returning. Only minutes prior, The atmosphere had been practically alive, seething with mere music and a chorus of different voices. Now it was nearly empty, save the soft whistling of a breeze and the crunching of pine needles beneath my boots. Prior to being selected, I adored silence. A quiet night always felt like home. Now I couldn't stand it. I knew I couldn't hear them moving. Objectively, I understood that. That didn't help me, though. It felt like I still heard them, all of them. Skittering, biting, drinking. Although the festivities at Camp Ehrlich had died down, my body remained a banquet. I tried to focus on the sensation of the bell in my hand. Previously, I had assumed the instrument was plastic. I'd never seen its espresso-coloured curves glimmer in the waning sunlight. It didn't feel like plastic, though. The material was tougher, less pliable, leathery. The thin handle felt almost dusty under my fingertips. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled out onto the other side of the forest. The sun had completely set, and the distant gurgling of rushing water had thankfully replaced the silence. With the last shimmering candle behind me, I continued moving. My eyes scanned the clearing. For a second, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn within the pines, but as my vision adjusted to the dim moonlight, I saw it. I always envisioned the bridge as this ornate, larger-than-life structure, gleaming steel wires holding up a polished metal walkway sturdy enough to support a parade. Anticipation had built at this moment into something ethereal and otherworldly. I accepted it to be so much more. The bridge was anything but otherworldly. Wooden, uncovered, barely wide enough to fit a sedan, if it could even support something so heavy. Judging by its length, it wouldn't take me more than 30 seconds to cross from Camp Ehrlich onto Glass Harbour. I ran my palm against the railing as I approached, pinky side down to avoid crushing a few of the parasites hooked into the centre of my hand. The only part that did live up to my expectations was the chasm that separated the two landmasses and its churning river. The water was so far beneath me that I couldn't see it. I only knew it was there because of its constant, dull roar. The sharp pain of a splinter digging into my flesh confirmed that this mystical piece of architecture was, in fact, not a figment of my imagination. I shook my hand, airing out the throbbing discomfort. It was all so mundane, humdrum, pathetic. Even, I felt my hummingbird of a heartbeat start to slow. For the briefest fraction of a moment, I found myself wondering what exactly I was so afraid of. Then, as if the universe had detected my naivety, the sound of creaking wood began to cut through the noise of rushing water. Someone was approaching, crossing the bridge from the opposite side. "Jackson," I whispered. The previous year's selected made themselves known. At the age of 12, they'd survived an entire year on Glass Harbour. "Wow, hey, Tom, you're not exactly who I was expecting," he replied. Like Amelia, he looked well, healthy, red-blooded and well-nourished, wearing the same denim overalls and white undershirt he left in. Glacial fear flooded down the length of my spine. Well, no time for catching up. "Mother Piper is waiting for you. Ring your bell when you get onto Glass Harbour. She'll take it from there," he continued. I made myself take a step. The brittle wood moaned in protest. I couldn't move further. I was paralysed, 1 foot on the bridge, 1 foot on Camp Ehrlich. Jackson seemed to sense my hesitation. He did not look upon it favourably. Despite being 6 years my junior and 1/3 my size, he became instantly aggressive with me. "That's a direct order, Tom. Start moving," he bellowed. My paralysis did not abate. "Have you forgotten your place in the hierarchy?" I said. "Move." "Get." He stopped right in front of me and gestured towards Glass Harbour. Despite his commands, I remained fixed in place. He tilted his head and shrugged his shoulders like he was profoundly confused by his inability to override my will. When he reached out to grab my shoulder, I'm not sure what came over me. I pushed him back with both hands, still grasping the bell in my right. Threw my whole weight into the movement as well. Despite my tick-borne anemia, the push had considerable force, and Jackson was a smaller than average kid. I just didn't want him to touch me, that's all. Please believe me, Jackson stumbled backwards. His pelvis connected with the railing. Before he could steady himself, his body was tilting over the side of the bridge. He didn't scream as he fell onto the rocks below. He was just gone. I paced back and forth in front of the bridge, clutching my head with both hands as if my skull would crumble to pieces if I didn't manually keep it all together. Fuck, fuck, fuck. Oh. I muttered. Previously grounding concepts like logic and rationality turned to soup in my mind. I lost all sense of reason. My eyes felt liable to pop out their sockets from the accumulating pressure of a repeating 6-word phrase. I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't mean to hurt him. It took me a minute of panicking to remember about the items I'd brought with me, and the epiphany hit me like a gut punch. I scrambled to the ground, rapidly untied my boots and pulled them off, laying the bell upright beside me. My trembling hand dug through each until I'd removed both insoles, and then I began shaking them over the grass. A pocket knife, a burner phone, and a compass plopped onto the dirt. It was forbidden to bring anything with you, excluding the bell. I didn't intend on leaving Camp Airlick unprepared. However, I grabbed the phone and flipped it open. Thankfully, I'd purged my savings to purchase the version that came equipped with a rudimentary but functional flashlight. I creeped over to where Jackson had plummeted over the railing, with visions of his misshapen, tangled limbs and splattered viscera running through my mind. I took as deep a breath as I was able and peered over the edge. It was about a 6-story drop down to the river. The water was shallow and littered with jagged rocks. The dim light only gave a general view of the area under the bridge, but I still didn't spot any blood. Jackson, Jackson, are you okay? I shouted. My ragged voice echoed against the walls of the canyon. Other than that, I didn't get a response. I kept searching, praying for signs of life. I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't mean to hurt him. At one point, I attempted to call 911. The realization that there wasn't enough signal to get my call through felt like I'd just swallowed a barbell. Nausea swam viscous laps around the pit of my stomach. "Jackson, where are you?" I screamed. Then my eyes hooked onto something. It wasn't clear what I was seeing at first. Even once I better comprehended what I was staring at, it didn't make sense. Elevated above the water on each side of the river were long stretches of flat, bare rock. On the camp side of the riverbank, I spotted Jackson's denim overalls, but his body wasn't in them. No blood, either. I backpedaled from the railing. Since I'd been selected, I'd lived in a state of perpetual lightheadedness. Sometimes it was worse, sometimes it was better, but it never completely went away. At that moment, the feeling was at its absolute worst, amplified exponentially by another damning realization. They're all waiting for him back at Camp Airlick. What the fuck are they going to do when he doesn't come back? The vertigo grew too heavy. I fell to the rapidly spinning earth. In the process, I accidentally knocked over the bell. It clattered against the ground behind me. The soft sound of a few muffled rings filled the air. My body erupted with movement. Somehow the chiming of the bell had incited a mass exodus. The ticks were leaving. The banquet was over. The sensation was wildly overstimulating, but beyond welcome. I pivoted my torso, intent on ringing the bell another handful of times for good measure. I wanted every single parasite that had infested my body to hear the message. The bell was quickly becoming unusable, however. I watched in stunned horror as the instrument deteriorated into a familiar mess of silent skittering. Starting with the rim, ticks splintered off the chassis and disappeared within the grass. Slowly, an organic disintegration progressed up the device. Once the handle melted away, there wasn't anything left. It was like the bell had never been there in the first place. I turned back to the bridge. My weary heart did another round of chaotic somersaults in my chest at the sight of another figure on the bridge. One whose approach hadn't been demarcated by the creaking of wood. She waved and beckoned for me to follow. Her green eyes were unmistakable. Amelia. She never really walked, per se. Amelia would always be a few feet ahead of me. As I got closer, I'd blink. Then she'd be a little bit farther away. My sister was like a fishing lure. As soon as I'd get near enough to pull her into a hug, the thing holding the fishing rod would yank her back. Rinse and repeat. Honestly, I didn't care. Real, hallucination, illusion, mirage, it didn't matter to me. It was Amelia. She didn't really talk either. Not until I got closer to the thing manifesting her, at least. Even then, the word talking doesn't really do the experience justice. It was more that foreign thoughts were inserted into my brain from somewhere outside myself. Rather than a vocal conversation, a few short minutes of following that spectre and I was there. In a lot of ways, Glass Harbour was a mirror image of Camp Ehrlich. There was the bridge, then the pines, then a large open field with buildings situated along its perimeter. To the untrained eye, the reflection probably would have been imperceptible, but I'd spent enough summers on those hallowed grounds to experience déjà vu as we made our way through the clearing. That's where the similarities end, however. Because the buildings that surrounded the field weren't the remnants of some camp. No, it was an abandoned town. Houses with chipping paint and broken windows in the process of being reclaimed by the land. Weeds and vines growing over the skeleton of this nameless orphaned suburb. As far as I could tell, none of the buildings resembled something industrial like a watery refinery, either. That said, I didn't exactly get to tour the ruins. Amelia had different plans. I followed her to a cliff at the western edge of the clearing, where the plateau began to drop off into the canyon below. It was treacherous, but she guided me down the side of the landmass until I was standing on the riverbank. At no point did my phone have enough signal to make a call. I considered turning back. I mean, I had an exit strategy coordinated with Hannah, my long-term girlfriend. The plan was I'd enter Glass Harbour and walk due south until I hit a country road that curved behind the plateau, where she should be waiting for me. From there, I'd call her. Once we found each other, we'd leave this place forever. Put it all behind us, drive in any one direction for hundreds of miles until we felt safe enough to stop running. For better or worse, though, I modified the plan and continued to follow Amelia. It didn't seem worth it to live a long life blind to the horrors of it all. I decided I'd rather live a much shorter life with the truth neatly situated behind my eyes, if that's what it took. As we got closer and closer to our destination, however, I began regretting that decision. A recognizable smell coated my nostrils as we passed under the wooden bridge. Musty. Fungal. Slightly sweet. Didn't take me long to figure out where I knew it from. It was the same smell that exploded out of the enclosed shower when I found Amelia bent over, heaving and coughing as she drank the liquid pouring out from the invasive coral-shaped tubes peeking out of the drain. 15 minutes later, I started to see those tubes in the wild, only a few at first, stuck firmly to the pathway. They were all connecting the river to something further upstream, and they pulsed with a thickening peristalsis. I couldn't tell if they were depositing something into the river or drawing water out of the river. I still don't know. Honestly, tried to step around the growths initially. Eventually, though, it was impossible to avoid stepping on them. They'd gotten too large and too numerous. I could barely visualize the bedrock suffocating under their cancerous spread. Finally, the ticks made their reappearance. I didn't even consciously notice them at first. As we were nearing our destination, however, I slipped on one of the tubes. So close to their origin point, they'd become increasingly dilated, 1/2 foot in diameter, give or take. Because of that, their peristaltic waves had developed significant energy. The tip of my boot got caught on the rippling tissue, and I fell forward, placing my hand on the cliff wall to avoid falling over completely. I crushed a few dozen parasites as a result. Hundreds of thousands of motionless ticks were uniformly covering the rock wall. I retracted my hand and, using the other, violently scraped my palm, desperate to expel the small chunks of insectoid debris and still twitching legs from my skin. Up ahead, Amelia waved and smiled at me, unbothered. When I looked back at where my hand met the wall, the ticks had already filled in the space, and all was still. Their phalanx was infinite and unshakable. Then she pointed at a hole in the wall aside her phantasmal body, and I felt what would be the first of many foreign thoughts being injected into my head. Mother Piper is waiting for me. In accordance with the deal made over 1/2 a century ago, I'm due to receive my portion of the new blood. No need to feel fear. Her children have done their job. My body is ripe for the transplant. After all, those who leave for Glass Harbour have perfect potential. Those who return a year later are perfect. I peered into the hungry darkness of the hole. I'd need to slide on my back in order to fit. One last time, I turned to look at Amelia. The more I appreciated her familiar green eyes, the more I came to terms with the fact that she clearly wasn't real. There was no fire behind them. They were empty, utterly vacant of the person I'd cared so much about. Truthfully, her eyes weren't much different from the hungry darkness of the hole in front of me. In that pivotal moment, I devised a new mantra, something to replace Glass Harbour's hollow, dogmatic tagline. Ava, Lucas, Charlotte, Liam, Evelyn, James, Amelia, Henry, Bailey, and Jackson. Again, I told myself. Ava, Lucas, Charlotte, Liam, Evelyn, James, Amelia, Henry, Bailey, and Jackson. Ava, Lucas, Charlotte, Liam, Evelyn, James, Amelia, Henry, Bailey, and Jackson. Ava, Lucas, Charlotte, Liam, Evelyn, James, Amelia, Henry, Bailey, Jackson, and everyone that came before them. I flipped open the burner phone, turned on the flashlight, and began sliding my body into the hole